Hey, so in something of an inception moment, I'm introducing myself because I'm speaking today and we're launching a brand new series called More Than Enough. I'm going to talk all about what that is about, but glad to have you with us for that series. And I would personally invite you to join us over the next 3 weeks as we continue through this series, More Than Enough. Well, hey there, Elevate friends and family. Great to have you with us today. Now, right out of the gate, I want to make a bold statement. And here's the statement. There's a specific thing that if and when you choose to do it, you will be in the tightest slipstream of God's example than if you were to do any other comparable thing. So it's a bold statement. If you do this one thing, and now here's a clue. Jesus said, recorded in John 3:16, arguably one of the most famous statements, one of the most therefore famous Bible passages in the entire Bible. Jesus famously said this is how much God loved the world. He gave his son, his one and only son. In other words, God's greatest expression of love came in the form of giving. Now, I was in my high school debate team, and so if this was me preparing my debate as to why my bold statement at the top, my premise that there's this one thing, giving, that if we choose to do it, and when we choose to do it, we're in the closest slipstream than compared to any other thing that we might choose to do as Jesus followers. So I'd present you with this flyover. God is love. God does love. And God's finest expression of love was and is giving. Therefore, when we give, we are demonstrating and echoing and mirroring the finest expression of God's love. Love gives. So today we are launching a brand new series called More Than Enough. And it's just a 3-week series, and we're going to take you through some of the highlights of a couple of chapters of a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. Now, I've billed this series and what we're going to be teaching and what we're going to be hopefully encouraging you to move towards as one of the most important shifts we can make as followers of Jesus. So there's a bold claim. There's a lot of things we need to learn as followers of Jesus. I would put what we're going to be covering in this series in my top 10, maybe top 5, certainly right up there. And so this particular shift, if you choose to make it, will have an enormous impact on everything: relationships, health, finances, career. And just to give you the spoiler up front, the shift is the shift from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. Now, hold that thought. Let me mess with your head a little bit more as we continue. Question, ask yourself, wherever you're watching this from, who likes receiving gifts? Yeah, we celebrated Christmas just over a month ago, and no doubt many of you got gifts, and hopefully they were gifts you appreciated. I got some gifts, and I'm like, I love this. Nothing wrong with gifts, but there's something Jesus said that kind of flips the script. Well, largely flips the script. And he said it's more blessed to give than to receive. He didn't say there's anything wrong with receiving gifts. He just said, and the inference probably being that when we receive gifts, sure, we're blessed. But he talks about that when we give, that the scales of blessing actually shift in favor of giving as being a pathway to being blessed over receiving more blessed to give. Okay, well, let's look into that. Now, here's the flow code. If you go smartphone camera, scan that. It's going to take you to the Bible app. It's going to take you to the letter. And in fact, the very chapter of the letter that I mentioned we're going to be teaching from, 2 Corinthians. This is chapter 8. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to do a flyover of chapter 8 and chapter 9. Now, while you're doing that, let me just give you some context of Paul writing this letter. He wrote this letter to the church in Corinth. Paul himself was a pioneer of the early church, and he wrote numerous letters of instruction and encouragement to various churches around the known world. Now, Paul actually, before becoming a Jesus follower, was a Jewish leader and then became a Jesus follower. And initially, basically everyone that started following Jesus, effectively the very first chapter of the church, were all Jews. And there was this kind of roadblock that the early church hit. The early church, all made up of Jews at one point in history, was the question of whether God wanted the Jesus followers, who were Jewish previously, to take the message of Jesus beyond the Jewish world into what was known at the time as the Gentiles, which was essentially everyone who wasn't Jewish. Thankfully, the big wigs of the early church, James, Peter, and John, they kind of worked this through and was like, yeah, Jesus came for everybody. And so they sent Paul and other early church pioneers out into the Gentile world to launch churches. One of the charges that the bigwigs specifically gave to the early church pioneers was that when you're preaching about the good news of Jesus, make sure you teach them about the importance of generosity. And so now we fast forward, there's a church in Corinth and Paul's writing to them. And actually at this point, he starts to brag about another church, the church in Macedonia. And he's bragging to the Corinth church about the Macedonian Jesus followers. This is what he wrote. Now, I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, what God in his kindness has done through the churches in Macedonia. They're being tested by many troubles, and they're very poor. But they're also filled with abundant joy, which has overflowed in rich generosity. There's kind of two paradoxes right at play there. They're tested by many troubles, and yet they're overflowing with joy. Like, how does that work? Well, it does in God's perspective of life. And then very poor and overflowing in rich generosity. And in fact, when Paul uses this phrase, very poor, he's not talking about what we might think of in first world countries as very poor, like, oh, I'm so poor, I might have to cancel one of my streaming services. No, he says the word, in fact, elsewhere it's translated as deep poverty. They were in deep poverty, and the word deep is the same word that we would use to describe as deep as the ocean. So they were like at the bottom of the bottom, and yet he was crediting them and bragging about them as overflowing in rich generosity, which on the surface, I'll admit, may not make sense. But this is what we're going to be teaching about over these next few weeks. It's a very different mindset to the mindset that our culture espouses. Our culture espouses that generosity is kind of like the last on the list, and only really something you do if you've got anything left over after you've first spent everything on your own needs. But here's one thing that God's economy highlights, and that's the fact that some people who aren't generous don't have a money problem. They actually have a mindset problem. They're limited by what, as I said earlier, is known as a scarcity mindset. A scarcity mindset has the narrative, I don't have enough, I'm never going to have enough, there's never going to be enough, and so I can't be generous, because if I'm generous, that's going to leave me with less. But the scarcity mindset is rooted in self-reliance, that somehow you're the source of provision and blessing into your life, and that you are limited, therefore. And the consequence is that people with a scarcity mindset actually live out of fear. The contrast is an abundance mindset. And this shift, I've said it already, I'm going to say it again, this shift from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset is a game changer. The abundance mindset is actually born out of the realization that we serve a God who is more than enough, and he's our provider. He doesn't run out. He's not barely enough. He's not just enough. He's certainly not less than enough. No, he's more than enough. He's our source, and consequently, people who have an abundance mindset don't operate out of fear. They operate out of faith, out of joy, and have a confidence that they can be generous, and they're not going to run out. They're not going to be left with less. Now, I'd like to think I operate with an abundance mindset now. I mean, I'm always wanting to grow, absolutely. But full disclosure, I grew up with a scarcity mindset. In a family and a church culture, a church context where it was just sort of like assumed, yeah, we don't have enough, we're never going to have enough, so generosity isn't really on the docket for us. But my mindset started to change when I started to read my Bible, and learn how God's economy works. How God is more than enough, and that when we start to trust him as being the source of all provision, it changes everything. Here's an example of something that pointed me in the abundance mentality direction, something that Solomon wrote. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops, in other words, the first of your income, and then your barns will be filled to overflowing. So it's like, give the first away and you'll have more than enough left over. And your vats will brim with new wine. This is a blessing that God promises that's triggered upstream by obedience. If I, then he. And really, you need to kind of want to be pointing your life in the direction of an abundance mindset, even if you're not there yet, to even take the first step with this. Now, Solomon in the agricultural era that he was writing to, he talked about barns overflowing and more wine than you can handle. He talked about bringing the first fruits. Okay, so if we talk about bringing first income, does that mean that you're going to get a ring on your doorbell and there's going to be like a security van that's pulled up, reversed into your driveway, and they're unloading pallets of cash the next day as a result? Well, maybe. But maybe not. Now, God absolutely can, does, will, has, can again, will again bless us financially, but it's not like a lottery win. It's not like a vending machine, put in 10 and get out 1,000. It's about, actually, God is more than enough of anything that we're lacking. And in fact, oftentimes, and God will, he will look after you and protect you and supply your needs, and maybe even more than your needs financially. But look, he also will get things to you that you might be lacking that actually money can't buy. Peace, joy, hope. And so this invitation is to live and move to an abundance mindset. And as I said, I grew up with a scarcity mindset. I am kind of more in team abundance mindset now, but it was a journey and it didn't happen overnight. In fact, I'd gone through Bible college in my mid-20s. There was a particular time that I graduated and I was now working on the staff at a church. And, therefore one of the leaders in the church. And there was this particular time where I felt God say to me to give $200 to one of my colleagues. And I was like, ooh, because I didn't really have $200 lying around. We were early in our church staff ministry role. We were on sort of the lower end of the pay scale, and I was like, now, I knew it was God because the devil never asks us to be generous towards other people. So I knew it was God, but I didn't just kind of hand over the $200 straight away. I did eventually, but here's the reveal. It took me 9 months before I gave my colleague the $200 that I felt God had asked me to give 9 months prior. Now I hope the lag time for me is less, and sometimes there's no lag time. I'm just letting you know that it's a journey. But here's the thing, and here's the essential thing. You won't know God's faithfulness in the area of provision unless you first step out in faith. It sort of seems paradoxical, like you want to have the faith and then you're going to operate out of that. But to jumpstart things or to level up with things, you actually have to take a step that's above your current faith level and then trust, and I confidently say, see God respond with his faithfulness. And then you're like, you're now able to operate at another level of faith because you've seen God come through when you took that step. So something that we are talking about and launching through this series, and we very intentionally coupled it with this series, is an opportunity to pioneer the next chapter of Elevate Church, which is going to require us taking another step of faith and trusting that God's going to be faithful, providing, prove himself to be more than enough in our lives individually and in our lives together as a church. And it's this. It's what we're calling building the future and launching a specific opportunity to be a pioneer in this generation. Now, something that you might not know about me is I actually listen to Singapore radio. I'm based in Perth, Western Australia. I listen to Singapore radio most mornings. Now, I'm not Singaporean. I've never lived in Singapore. I've been there a number of times. I really love the place. Anyway, it's a long story. But it means I know a lot more about Singapore than probably you would expect. One of the things that is important to understand about Singapore is it's an island nation with no natural resources. Now, it was a little over 50 years ago that it became an independent nation, a republic, in fact. And this new republic, independent republic, with no natural resources, no hinterland, today has the highest GDP per capita of any country in the entire world. Just 50 years since becoming an independent. And they sit high up. Singapore, the country and the citizens sit high up on all of the important parameters of what it looks like to be a thriving, flourishing country. And they have a group of people that the government officially refers to as the pioneer generation. And these were the people who, a little over half a century ago, rolled their sleeves up and got behind the vision of the first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. and did the hard work and did the heavy lifting and broke the new ground and plowed things that had never been done before in that nation. And today they're honored and given opportunities and rewards under the banner of the pioneer generation. The thing about pioneers is pioneers make stuff happen. Without them, you can't claim new territory, you won't seize new opportunities, and you'll never reach new levels. So we as Elevate Church, this is actually us in our 74th year. And we stand on the shoulders of many pioneers who have gone before us. The first group is this group, who in 1950 called themselves the Wayside Sunday School, a group of adults who we know nearly nothing about. And they gathered together some kiddos under a tree in the suburb that our church facilities now reside. And they basically had nothing. I mean, they had no building, they had no budget. They just had the Bible and a commitment to teach children about Jesus. Well, 4 years later, that Sunday school actually became a church, became Rivervale Church of Christ, which is now Elevate Church. And we've seen iterations of pioneers throughout, including in the 1980s, a group of people who over the course of a decade did some enormous pioneering, led by Barry Ryle, who is a champion, and they moved, they got things done. They started laying bricks, digging trenches, demolishing the manse, buying houses adjacent, building our current auditorium that we enjoy here in Perth throughout the weekend on Sundays. It was incredible, just what they did. And we now have stepped into that and sit on their shoulders. Well, in 2015, we took another step, not building auditoriums or laying bricks or digging trenches or pouring concrete. We bought another property. And so now, Elevate Church, we now sit on 6,000 square meters, a footprint, just 5 minutes from the Perth city. It's phenomenal. You just would not get this piece of land today. It just wouldn't exist. And what we're talking about throughout this series is we have a mortgage on the house that we bought in 2015. The balance is $700,000. Now, for some of you, you're like, well, that sounds like a lot of money. And for others, you're like, is that all? Let me give you a frame of reference. This is Joel and Victoria Osteen, who 2 weeks ago, this photo was taken of them ripping up the bank mortgage that their church has had for the last 20 years. 20 years ago, this is Lakewood Church in Houston, Texas, a very influential church. They bought and moved into the sports arena that was then home to the NBA team, the Houston Rockets. And the church took out, listen to this, a $100 million loan from Bank of America to convert the facilities to a functional working church in that space. And they've just been eating away and chipping away at that mortgage until 2 weeks ago, they finally made the last payment. So we don't have $100 million mortgage. We have a $700,000 mortgage, and we want to go after that. We've been just paying the minimum and keeping the bank happy. The problem is that the money that we've been paying to that mortgage, some of that's been coming from our first 10% giving. We want to see that first 10% giving going into resourcing ministry, not keeping a bank happy. But this is going to require us stepping up and actually giving in addition to our regular giving. Now, there's a biblical precedent for this. Back when God had instructed David and his son Solomon to build a new temple in Jerusalem, the people then were already giving their tithes, their first 10%, to God, to the ministry. they stepped up and they started giving in addition to the actual building that God was calling them to give. And David led by example. He gave first, and Louis and I have been doing that already since last November. Our team have started to step up just like the people in David and Solomon's time. You can read about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 29. It's just an incredibly inspiring example of what it means to sacrifice and to pioneer and to be generous and to live out of an abundance mindset. So Paul, coming back to what he was bragging about the church in Macedonia to the church in Corinth, said, "For I can testify that they gave not only what they could afford, but far more. And they did it of our own free will." So that's what we're inviting you to join. Be a part of building the future. Be a part of becoming the next pioneer generation as Elevate Church. And there's a bunch of wins. Things like ownership. And when we move closer to ownership, gives us much more flexibility to make our own decisions. We're not dictated by the bank as to what we can and can't do. And so we can refurbish things. We can change things. We can make sure that we have spaces and places that are more effective to both doing ministry here in Perth and also growing our ability to reach people and build people locally and globally. It frees up financial resources for that purpose. And here's our good friend Rick Painter from Gateway Church in Melbourne sharing some words of encouragement for us as we launch this next pioneer opportunity.
Well, g'day, Elevate Church. Today I'm speaking to you from the online studios of Gateway Church in Melbourne, which is part of the A2A Church Network in Australia. Now, I was with you in person last November, and it's great to have this opportunity to share with you again as you consider together what God is showing you about pioneering again. From my discussions with Mark and from the potential I saw at your church site, Elevate stands on the edge of amazing possibility, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to forge ahead into the future, to pioneer again, as did the saints of former years. It's not an easy thing to do, to imagine and dream. It's even harder to lead others to see what is yet unseen. So I commend Pastor Mark and the Elevate leadership team for their vision and faithfulness as they lead you in this season. When we found the building that has become the home of Gateway Church, it was just an abandoned factory. I remember thinking, can we do this? It's going to take a lot of faith for this to become a house of worship. At that time, an elderly member of our church who was with me at that first meeting shared with me later about a similar time when the people of his former church bought vacant land in order to build a church building. And he said something like this: "Rick, in my experience, Christians always stand on the shoulders of faithful followers who have gone before them, who gave their time, talent, and treasure to make real what was not yet. Every generation must lay foundations for future generations of faith. But take heart. Pioneering has always been a hallmark of the Christian church." I'll never forget those words, and I'll always hold that encouragement close to my heart, because it also rings true with what God's word tells me about times when we just need to trust God and step forward. In 1 Corinthians 2:9 we read, "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no mind has imagined what God has prepared for those who love him." It takes faith and sacrifice by the people of God to bring to completion the work of God. I want to say that again. It takes faith and sacrifice by the people of God to bring to completion the work of God. Elevate Church, I'm so excited by what I believe you can achieve together. It's time to pioneer again for the sake of the gospel and the kingdom of God in your city. God bless you.
Hey, so I know I've sort of dropped this on you, and look, we're going to be talking about this over the next 3 weeks. But if you're ready to kind of open yourself up to being included as part of the next pioneer generation of Elevate Church, I just want you to go to our website, elevatechurch.me. The address is on the screen here. Scroll to the bottom, you'll see Contact Us, and hit us up and say, I'd like more information about building the future, or I want to be part of the next pioneer generation, or count me into pioneer. Whatever language suits you best, we'll send you some information. And from there, if you're ready and willing and able and excited to be part of this, then I will personally include you in the ongoing communication that we're starting with the people who are joining this next pioneer generation. So we'd love to hear from you. And listen, come on this journey. Next few weeks, let God build your faith. Let God continue to move you from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. And let us together take new ground and see what God's going to do for us, in us, and through us.